A rapper locked out of his own studio, another rapper posting the footage, the internet laughing for 48 hours and moving on. Here's what the internet missed. The footage went up on February 19th, 2026, but the lease behind it had already been legally terminated on February 17th, and the eviction notices that produced that termination started running in January, before anyone outside this dispute knew there was a dispute. The eviction sequence was already moving before the public campaign started. What changed when it went public was the dollar figure attached to it, and that figure moved significantly depending on who was speaking and what they were saying it in. Three numbers are going to come up in this story: $80,000, $180,000, and $250,000. They don't come from the same source. They're not describing the same thing. And where they diverge is exactly where the most important decisions in this story got made.
Right now, he owes, I'm going to say in a short way, at least $80,000, if not $180,000.
Let's map it. On February 19th, 2026, security footage went public showing Jim Jones in a hallway outside IFC Film Studios in the Bronx. The lights were off. The locks had been changed. The power had been cut. Jones worked through one door, then pushed through a second. Curtis Jackson, 50 Cent, posted the footage. He captioned it with a reference to the podcast Jones co-hosts. Let's rap about it. But that footage wasn't the start of anything. By the time it went up, a formal eviction process had already concluded. According to the eviction notice 50 Cent posted publicly, addressed to Joseph Jones and IFC Management LLC, which is Jones's corporate entity for the studio. A 15-day default notice had expired January 22nd, 2026. A 5-day termination notice expired February 17th. The footage was filmed 2 days after the lease was already legally terminated.
We also have a partnership agreement where half of what he's building now, his media, belongs to us. But he won't tell us how much he's making and doing all these things. So half of the content he's creating, if you want to buy that too, I'll sell you half the company.
So the changed locks and disconnected power are consistent with the documented eviction timeline. That part of the legal sequence holds up.
He was watching them be that, like Mace be that and Cam be that, and looked at, and it was finally, he had one. See how, when you see, he like, oh, he really like that. Give me this, give me.
The question isn't whether Jones lost access to the building on those dates. Based on the posted notices, that part appears sound.
He's like insane. To me, it's worth very little to nothing. But if it works out for you, I just throw that in as a sweetener. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is he signed a lease with me.
What's worth examining is everything built around it. How the financial numbers shifted publicly, what ownership actually meant in this context, and whether calling the occupants squatters reflects the legal record or something else entirely.
But he won't sign the lease. He's like, I don't like these terms. I want like 6 months of build out and ridiculous bullshit.
Here's the first thing worth flagging. The debt figure moved a lot. The building's owner, identified publicly only by the first name Sam, described the financial situation to 50 Cent in a phone call that 50 Cent recorded and posted. In that call, per the research record, the base rent delinquency Sam described was somewhere between $80,000 and $180,000. By the time 50 Cent was posting on Instagram, the figure he was using publicly was $250,000. That higher number became the headline version. That gap is not a rounding error. The difference between $80,000 and $250,000 is more than 200%. And no independent court filing or verified financial document has been confirmed that establishes the exact amount owed.
Is it acceptable for someone to create a documentary about you without your approval? How would you feel if it happened to you?
The figures in circulation came from a social media caption and a one-sided phone recording, not from anything filed in a court. And here's a distinction that matters for everything that follows. A number in a court filing is a claim subject to legal scrutiny. A number in an Instagram caption is a narrative choice. The second contradiction is the squatter label itself. Here's what the record actually shows. Jones and his co-hosts were not squatters in the legal sense. IFC Management LLC held a formal lease agreement for the space. They were tenants. What changed was that the lease terminated following the notice sequence. After February 17th, they were still present in a space where their legal right to be there had expired. That's a different situation from squatting, which implies no legal basis for occupancy at any point. The research record makes this explicit. The squatter framing implied total absence of legal right, when the actual record shows a tenancy that deteriorated into default. Does that distinction change the eviction outcome in practical terms? Less so. The lease was terminated. The legal process was documented. Jones lost access to the space as of February 17th. But the framing matters because it's how the financial narrative got built. Squatters means these people were never legitimate tenants. Tenants who defaulted on a lease is a different story, and one that raises a follow-on question. Why did the dispute reach default? And what triggered making it public when it became public? That's the decision point we'll map next. What happened between when the lease was signed and when those notices started running? And how does a podcast conversation about documentaries fit into the timeline of a commercial eviction? Let's map the sequence, because the timing here is specific enough that it tells its own story. December 15th, 2025. Jim Jones, Milo Face, and Dave East, the three co-hosts of Let's Rap About It, are recording an episode. The conversation turns to documentaries, specifically, whether it's acceptable to make one about someone without their approval. The room's position was clear. Jones called the concept facetious and petty. The group framed unauthorized documentary making as a form of public exposure designed to damage someone without their consent or cooperation. Jones used the word mockumentary. The criticism was pointed enough that 50 Cent, who had just released a Netflix documentary series examining allegations against Sean Combs, took it as a direct reference to his work. Whether the comments were explicitly directed at him or part of a broader conversation about the documentary format was never fully resolved. Milo Face later clarified on Instagram that his remarks were about documentaries in general, but by that point, the clarification didn't move the needle. 50 Cent treated it as personal, at least publicly. One day later, December 16th, 50 Cent posted. He labeled the hosts squatters and bums. He alleged they owed up to $250,000 in unpaid rent for the studio they were recording in. He offered to buy the studio outright. That sequence is worth sitting with. Podcast conversation, December 15th. Public financial allegation with a specific dollar figure, December 16th. One day apart. Here's what the record confirms about that timing. The eviction notices that followed the December posts didn't appear overnight. The 15-day default notice that expired January 22nd had to have been issued in early January at the latest, meaning the formal legal process was either already in motion before the podcast or was initiated very quickly afterward. Either way, the legal track and the public campaign were running in parallel from the start. So the rent delinquency existed before December 15th. The lease conditions existed before December 15th. What changed on December 16th was the decision to make that information public, at maximum volume, with a specific dollar figure attached. Two timing, consistent explanations fit the observable record. The research doesn't confirm which one is accurate, so here are the only two reads that hold up against the timeline. The first, 50 Cent was already in contact with the landlord about a deteriorating tenancy before the podcast episode aired. The December 15th broadcast gave him a public justification for escalating what was already a private dispute and reframing the criticism. You're questioning my ethics while you can't pay your own bills. The second, 50 Cent heard the podcast, reached out to the landlord specifically to gather leverage, and moved fast because the window for maximum narrative impact was narrow. The first explanation fits better with the legal sequence. A formal eviction process doesn't get initiated overnight, but the research doesn't confirm exactly when 50 Cent first made contact with the landlord or when the landlord-tenant relationship began deteriorating formally. Either way, here's what the timeline does show. 50 Cent controlled when each piece of the process became visible. He held the release schedule for both the legal track and the public campaign. That's the observable fact, regardless of which explanation you find more convincing. Christmas Day, 2025. The co-hosts responded. They released a freestyle titled Squatters' Rights, recorded over 50 Cent's own production. Bold in concept. In terms of strategic positioning, it was a significant miscalculation. Here's why. The freestyle kept the story alive and gave 50 Cent something to respond to. It also accepted the frame of the dispute as a hip-hop exchange, bars for bars, Instagram for Instagram. When 50 Cent was not operating in that lane at all, he wasn't building toward another track, he was building toward a document trail. Responding with a freestyle to someone holding lease termination notices is like showing up to a contract negotiation with a mixtape. The registers don't match, and within weeks, the next move wasn't another post, it was a phone call. The landlord recording is one of the most significant pieces of this sequence. The most important thing to understand about it up front is what it is, and what it isn't. What it is, an audio recording posted by 50 Cent of a conversation between him and the building's owner, Sam. In that call, Sam described the landlord-tenant relationship as having broken down. He said lease terms were never fully formalized, that Jones had requested build-out concessions, and that Jones had declined to disclose earnings related to what Sam characterized as a contractual stake in the podcast's content output. Not just the room it was recorded in, but the episodes produced inside it. What the recording is not, independent verification of any of those claims. The call was recorded and posted by 50 Cent. Sam's account is presented without any response from Jones. No LLC filing, no partnership agreement, no content licensing contract has been publicly confirmed that establishes the landlord as a co-owner of the podcast. The research record rates this as supported only by the recording itself, not corroborated by any third-party document. Flag 1, one-sided. Flag 2 matters more for understanding how the eviction became a public campaign. Sam was willing to record this conversation with 50 Cent and allow it to be posted publicly to an audience of millions, while his tenant was still in active default proceedings. That's not a standard move. At minimum, he cooperated with one side's public campaign against his tenant, something landlords don't always do in active proceedings. That cooperation is what made the February 19th footage possible. The security cameras belonged to the building. By February 19th, 50 Cent had access to them. A landlord who cooperates with your campaign is a landlord who hands you the footage. Whether Sam's cooperation created any legal exposure on his end is not something the available record confirms. We can note it as an unusually public use of building access during an active tenancy proceeding and leave the assessment there. January 22nd, 2026, the 15-day default notice expired. No resolution on record. February 17th, 2026, the 5-day termination notice expired. The lease was legally terminated. February 19th, 2026, the footage went up from podcast episode to eviction footage, 66 days. Let's go through the receipts, not what's circulated, what's verifiable, what's supported, and what's still missing. This matters because 4 separate claims drove the public narrative, and each one lands differently when you check it against the documented record. Receipt 1, the eviction. This is the most solid piece of the record. The eviction notice 50 Cent posted was addressed to Joseph Jones and IFC Management LLC. It cited a 15-day default notice expiring January 22, 2026, followed by a 5-day termination notice expiring February 17th. The security footage was filmed February 19th, 2 days after the termination date on the posted notice. Multiple reporting outlets confirmed the same expiration dates independently. What that means practically, when Jones arrived at the studio on February 19th, his legal right to be in that space had already expired. The changed locks and disconnected power are consistent with what a landlord is permitted to do following a completed eviction notice sequence. That part of the narrative, that Jones had lost legal access to the space, is supported by the documented record. What the eviction notice does not establish: the exact amount owed, the full lease history, or whether any resolution attempts occurred between the notice dates and February 19th. Those pieces remain unconfirmed in the public record. Receipt 2. This is where the record gets complicated and where the narrative diverged most sharply from what the documents support. 3 numbers circulated publicly: $80,000, $180,000, and $250,000. They didn't come from the same source. They weren't presented as a range by the people citing them. Each was stated as the number at different points in the campaign. Here's what the research record establishes about each figure. The $80,000 to $180,000 range reflects what Sam described in the recorded phone call as the base rent delinquency. The $250,000 figure is the number 50 Cent used publicly on Instagram. The jump between those 2 data points, from the landlord's account to the public caption, has not been explained by any filed document. We don't know what's inside the $250,000 number. It may reflect rent, fees, damages, or a combination. It may simply be a headline figure. The record doesn't tell us because the record for that number is an Instagram caption, not a court filing. Think of it this way: the landlord's account, $80,000 to $180,000 from a phone call. The public caption, $250,000. Same dispute, different numbers, no adjudicated figure in between. No court filing has been confirmed that establishes any of these as the amount legally owed. That's not a minor distinction, and it's the most important thing to keep in mind when you hear the $250,000 figure repeated as fact. Based on the available record, it's also the least documented of the 3 numbers. Receipt 3, the ownership claim. This is the largest gap between the narrative and the record. On or around February 19th, 50 Cent posted, "Sam is my partner. I own the joint." If accurate, that statement would mean 50 Cent had acquired either a full ownership stake or a controlling partnership interest in the building, which would explain his access to the security system and his standing to be involved in the eviction at all. The research record checked for a deed transfer, no publicly confirmed property transaction, no deed transfer, no LLC filing, no Bronx County property record, has been found connecting 50 Cent or a G-Unit affiliated entity to the building as of the research cutoff. If he truly owns it, there's usually a public paper trail eventually. That paper hasn't surfaced yet. What the research does confirm is financial capacity. 50 Cent's Shreveport real estate acquisition, a documented deal, establishes that he operates in commercial property at scale. The absence of a confirmed deed is not proof that no transaction occurred. It may reflect a filing not yet processed, a structure through a middleman entity not yet identified, or an arrangement that doesn't constitute traditional ownership at all. The research record's framing is careful here, and it's the right call. 50 Cent's role may have been that of a strategic partner or financier supporting the landlord's eviction, rather than a deed holder in the traditional sense. That framing explains the surveillance access and the public cooperation without requiring a completed property transfer. But here's what that means for the narrative. I own the joint and I'm a strategic partner helping the landlord execute an eviction are very different statements. The first implies full control. The second implies aligned incentives. Both could explain the footage. Only one of them appeared in the caption. Receipt 4, the media stake claim. Back to the phone call. Sam made one claim that goes beyond unpaid rent. He said he owned half of the podcast itself, not just the room it was recorded in, but a contractual stake in the content output of Let's Rap About It. Per Sam's account, Jones had refused to disclose earnings related to that arrangement, which was part of what sourced the breakdown. That would mean rent wasn't the only fight. There'd be a revenue share fight too, but right now we only have the landlord saying it. No secondary document has been publicly confirmed that establishes this arrangement. No LLC filing, no partnership agreement, no content licensing contract between Sam and IFC Management LLC has appeared in the record. The research record rates this as supported by the recording itself, but not corroborated by any independent source. That matters for how you read the escalating debt figure. If the media stake claim is real and documentable, the landlord's grievance wasn't just about rent. It was about a business partner who went dark on a revenue sharing arrangement. That's a significantly more complex dispute than a straightforward tenancy default. If the claim has no supporting document, it's a detail that shaped the narrative without a verifiable foundation. The available record doesn't resolve that question, it leaves it open. Here's what the 4 receipts together establish. The eviction was real and legally documented. The debt figures were inconsistent and came from unverified sources. The ownership claim has not been confirmed by property records. The media stake claim has not been confirmed by any contract or filing. The legal process at the center of this story holds up. The financial narrative built around it contains significant gaps, and those gaps consistently pushed in one direction, making the scale and totality of Jones's failure appear larger than what the documents confirm. That's the record versus the narrative, mapped cleanly. One item does appear in the record as a reported outcome worth flagging here. Multiple outlets reported that Jones wired over $200,000 to the landlord in the days following the footage going public, reportedly to resolve the matter and retain access to the space. No official confirmation from Jones, his representatives, the landlord, or any financial filing has been established. This is reported by news outlets but not yet supported by a confirmed paper trail. Treat it accordingly. If the report is accurate, it produces an immediate tension. The group, publicly framed as unable to pay, came up with a substantial sum quickly once maximum pressure was applied. That either means the liquidity existed all along, which challenges the couldn't afford the lights narrative, or it means assets were liquidated under significant duress in a very short window. Neither reading is flattering, and both serve 50 Cent's narrative positioning, which is part of why the posting didn't stop when the payment reports emerged. If the report is not accurate, the financial outcome of this dispute remains publicly unresolved. The legal eviction was documented. Whether it produced an actual financial recovery is a question the public record doesn't yet answer. Either way, something gets confirmed. The pressure campaign produced a response. What that response cost, and whether it was forced or voluntary, the record doesn't yet tell us. What it does set up is the next question worth mapping. Why did this mechanism work as well as it did? That's not a question about Jones specifically. It's a question about the system 50 Cent. Let's step back from the individual moves and map the system underneath them. Every element of what happened between December 2025 and February 2026 served a specific function. None of it required a direct confrontation, a heated back and forth, or even a particularly public argument to get started. It required information, timing, and a landlord willing to cooperate. Understanding why each party in that system had a reason to participate is what separates this from a personality clash. So let's go stakeholder by stakeholder. 50 Cent's incentive structure. The surface read as personal. Jones criticized his documentary work. 50 Cent retaliated. That's true as far as it goes. But personal motivation doesn't explain the specific tools he chose. He didn't respond with music. He didn't respond with a social media argument. He went to the landlord. He obtained security footage. He posted lease termination documents with specific legal language and expiration dates. Those are not the tools of someone reacting emotionally. They're the tools of someone who understood that the most durable damage in this situation was financial and reputational, not personal. Here's the incentive calculation that fits the observable record. 50 Cent's media operation, his production work, the Power franchise, and documentary projects on major streaming platforms, including the Netflix Combs series, runs on what you could call narrative authority. One-line translation. Narrative authority is the ability to determine whose story gets told, how, and on what terms. That's the actual product 50 Cent sells. When Jones and his co-hosts publicly called that approach petty and exploitative, they weren't just criticizing a project, they were questioning the legitimacy of the business model itself. The response needed to accomplish two things at once: punish the criticism and reinforce the authority. A track handles the first. It does nothing for the second. What accomplishes both simultaneously is demonstrating that questioning 50 Cent's business judgment leads to a forensic examination of your own business situation, and that his situation will survive that examination far better than yours will. That's the underlying logic, and it works whether or not he owns the building, because the perception of control is what carries the narrative. Sam is my partner. I own the joint. Functions as a power statement regardless of what the deed says. The footage appears, the eviction notice appears, and the audience draws the conclusion he intended. The landlord's incentive structure. This is the most under-examined piece of this story, and it's actually central to how the whole mechanism operated. Sam was in a straightforwardly difficult position. He had a tenant in default. The default had been running long enough that formal eviction notices were required. He had, according to his own account in the recorded call, a business arrangement with that tenant that had broken down. Lease terms never fully formalized, build-out demands, alleged non-disclosure of earnings related to the media stake. Standard options in that situation: pursue the eviction quietly through housing court, attempt a negotiated resolution, or find a way to accelerate the pressure on the tenant to settle. Sam chose option 3, and he chose it by cooperating with the person his tenant was publicly feuding with. That cooperation gave him something he wouldn't have had otherwise: a platform. The phone call got posted to an audience of millions. The eviction documents got posted to an audience of millions. The security footage got posted to an audience of millions. For a landlord trying to recover unpaid rent and exit a problematic tenancy, that level of public pressure is not nothing. It dramatically accelerates the decision calculus. Once the eviction notices are running, the clock forces decisions, and public exposure speeds that clock up considerably. If the reported $200,000 payment is accurate, and we've noted that it hasn't been confirmed by primary sources, Sam recovered a significant sum far faster than housing court would have produced it. The cost to Sam: cooperating with a public campaign against his tenant during active proceedings is unusual territory. The research record doesn't confirm any legal action was initiated against him on those grounds, but the risk existed and he accepted it. That tells you something about how far the landlord-tenant relationship had deteriorated before any of this became public. Jim Jones's incentive structure and the constraint. Jones's situation going into this was defined by one fundamental constraint. The financial gap was real, and it limited every option available to him. The research record confirms the disparity. Using the most conservative public estimates on both sides, 50 Cent's net worth in the range of $40 million, Jones is in the range of $400,000 to $600,000. The gap is somewhere in the order of 80 to 1. These are estimate ranges, not audited numbers. Even with conservative figures, the gap is different leagues, big enough to shape every move in this situation, regardless of the precise numbers. When the disparity is that large, the available responses narrow significantly. Jones couldn't buy the building. He couldn't retain legal representation at a scale that would neutralize a property dispute turned media campaign. He couldn't outproduce 50 Cent in the content space. 50 Cent's media operation is structurally larger. What Jones could do, and did, was attempt to reframe the narrative on his own terms. The Kung Fu video, the studio walkthrough, the free promo framing. Each of those moves was designed to signal that the public humiliation wasn't landing the way the audience thought it was, that he was unbothered, that the attention was useful to him. It's a legitimate play under the circumstances and something worth acknowledging. The Let's Rap About It podcast reportedly remained in the top 10 of U.S. music commentary charts through this period. Platform-level consequences, at least as measured by chart position, were not catastrophic. The problem with the free promo frame is that it requires the audience to believe it, and the footage of Jones working through a locked door in a dark hallway is a very specific image to reframe. The response videos and the studio walkthrough are doing a lot of heavy lifting against that single image. There's also a ceiling on the free promo logic. It works until the financial distress narrative gets confirmed by the subject's own actions. If the reported $200,000 payment is accurate, the chain of logic runs like this. He paid to stay, which means the space mattered enough to pay for, which means losing access would have been a real loss, which means the pressure campaign produced a real outcome. That chain undercuts the I'm unbothered positioning without anyone having to say it directly. One more stakeholder worth naming: the audience. The people watching, sharing, and commenting weren't passive observers. Their attention was the asset being converted. Their perception was what the narrative authority argument depended on. And their behavior, sharing the footage, repeating the financial figures in comment sections, turning lobby boys into a running joke, is part of what extended the campaign beyond anything 50 Cent had to actively maintain. In mechanism terms, the audience had its own incentive, entertainment value, social currency from participating in the pile-on. Every share extended the campaign's reach without costing the originator anything. That's not a side effect, it's part of the design, Cameron's role, and what it illustrates. Cameron, Jones's former Dipset collaborator, mocked Jones publicly during the dispute, offering to send money via a payment app for heating costs. Jones fired back. The circle of active participants widened. Cameron's involvement appears to have been opportunistic rather than coordinated. He didn't need 50 Cent to direct him. The public pressure campaign created an opening for other parties with their own latent grievances to participate at essentially zero cost. Every new participant extended the news cycle without costing the originator anything. That's a secondary effect of the mechanism, not a primary one. But it illustrates something important about how a well-executed public pressure campaign generates its own amplification. The system doesn't just pressure the target. It invites everyone with a pre-existing grievance to join in. And each one who does makes the campaign look larger and more inevitable than it actually was at the point of origin. Here's the mechanism stated plainly, now that the evidence has walked us through it. 50 Cent identified a vulnerability. He converted that vulnerability into leverage. He made the leverage public at the moment of maximum impact, timed to the podcast criticism, executed through the landlord's cooperation. He then sustained the pressure long enough that the target had to respond on his terms rather than their own. That's the sequence, and it didn't start in 2025. To understand why this worked, you have to go back further than December 2025. Not far, just far enough to recognize the architecture. 50 Cent has been running a version of this system for over 2 decades. The specific tools change. Lyrical campaigns became document campaigns, but the underlying structure has been remarkably consistent. Recognizing it as a structure, rather than a series of personality clashes, is what separates a pattern audit from an entertainment recap. 2 precedents, not history lessons, mirrors. Precedent 1, the Ja Rule campaign, the original template. Early 2000s, 50 Cent ran a sustained campaign targeting Ja Rule's commercial standing, not primarily through direct confrontation, through systematic credibility erosion. He targeted the financial and artistic legitimacy of Murder Inc. as a business operation. He made the cost of staying affiliated with that ecosystem, in terms of public perception, higher than the benefit. The commercial result is verifiable. Ja Rule had 4 top 10 singles between 2000 and 2002. He hasn't charted since 2004. The industry read that shift as connected to 50 Cent's campaign. Whether the causation was clean is harder to confirm. What the record shows is the sequence. Sustained public pressure targeting a rival's business legitimacy, followed by a sharp and durable commercial decline. The template, stripped to its core, use conflict to generate content. Use content to generate industry positioning. The Jim Jones situation is the 2026 iteration of the same architecture. Different tools, property transactions and surveillance footage instead of mixtapes and radio drops. Identical logic. Precedent 2. The 2007 Dipset maneuver. The Jones-specific precedent. This one matters because it shows the targeting logic goes back nearly 2 decades. In 2007, Dipset was fracturing. Jones was coming off We Fly High, his first real solo commercial moment. And the hunger for individual recognition that came with it created a visible opening. 50 Cent invited Jones and Jules Santana to perform at a G-Unit show. They accepted. The line reportedly delivered that night, "We like Jimmy better than you anyway, Cam." Not a compliment to Jones, a wedge driven at the fracture point between two people who were supposed to be aligned. Sourcing note stated now, what follows draws from 50 Cent's own later public accounts. Self-reported strategy from a participant is perspective, not independently confirmed fact. What the observable record does confirm. The show happened, Jones appeared, and the Dipset fracture deepened around that period. The pattern across both moments, 2007 and 2026, is consistent. Read the specific vulnerability accurately, deploy leverage at the precise moment it's most exposed. Jones's desire for individual validation in 2007, Jones's financial exposure in 2025. Different levers, same targeting logic. What makes 2026 distinct? Property infrastructure as both the lever and the broadcast mechanism. Prior disputes required the audience to follow a sequence. Read the caption, know the backstory, connect the dots. The security footage collapsed all of that into a single image. A man in a dark hallway, working through a locked door, lights off, locks changed. Financial distress, loss of control, and public exposure communicated simultaneously before anyone read a word. The property partnership, whether full acquisition or strategic alignment, and the record leaves that open, gave 50 Cent physical access to the location where the story was happening, and control over when that access became visible. That's the evolution. Lyrical campaigns to document campaigns to infrastructure campaigns. Each iteration requires more capital. Each iteration is also more durable because the receipts are harder to dispute. A song can be called a lie. A lease termination notice has a date on it. If the goal was rent recovery, the reported payment would have ended the campaign. It didn't. So what was the actual goal? And was it reached? That's what the outcomes section addresses directly. Let's map what actually changed. 4 measurable outcomes. They don't all point in the same direction. Outcome 1, the financial resolution, reported, not confirmed. Multiple outlets reported that Jones wired over $200,000 to the landlord in the days following the February 19th footage, reportedly to resolve the matter and retain access to the space. No confirmation from Jones, his representatives, the landlord, or any financial filing. Reported by outlets, not yet supported by a confirmed paper trail. If the payment happened, the group publicly framed as unable to pay came up with a substantial sum quickly once maximum pressure was applied. That either means the liquidity existed all along, which challenges the couldn't afford the lights narrative, or assets were liquidated under significant duress in a very short window. Neither reading is flattering, and both serve 50 Cent's positioning, which is part of why the posting didn't stop when the payment reports emerged. Here's the decision point. If the goal was rent recovery, a confirmed payment closes the loop and the posting stops. If the goal was narrative dominance, establishing that questioning 50 Cent's work carries a specific public cost, and the payment is just evidence the mechanism worked. The posting continues because the campaign was never primarily about the money. The observable fact is that the posting continued. Draw your own conclusion. Outcome 2, platform standing, mixed. The podcast did not collapse. Reports indicate it remained in the top 10 of U.S. music commentary charts through the period of maximum pressure. Platform consequences, as measured by chart position, were not catastrophic. What shifted was the conversation around it. Before December 2025, commentary centered on content. After February 19th, the dominant public conversation was about the financial situation of the hosts. Comment sections moved toward mockery, from Dipset to Set, Lobby Boys. Those aren't just jokes, they're a new associative frame for the brand. A ratings recovery is possible. Changing what people think of first when they hear the show's name is a slower problem. Not destruction, but damage that compounds quietly. Outcome 3, the studio space, unresolved. As of February 21st, IFC Film Studios remained under construction but reportedly operational. Jones posted walkthroughs showing active build-out. Whether the reported payment restored his legal standing in the building is not confirmed in the public record. The ownership question has one clean resolution: a property filing in Bronx County records connecting a G-Unit entity to the building. That filing has not been confirmed. Until it is, the studio outcome remains the least resolved of the 4. Outcome 4, the reputation calculus, asymmetric. For 50 Cent, the campaign reinforced his positioning as someone who responds to criticism with disproportionate force using legal-looking artifacts, a businessman operating at a level where property partnership functions as a retaliatory tool. He didn't raise his voice, he posted documents. The speed with which he obtained and published building security footage during active eviction proceedings is a question the available record leaves open. No formal complaint or action on those grounds has been confirmed. For Jones, the reputational outcome is more clearly negative. The image of him in that hallway is now part of the public record in a way his response videos haven't neutralized. The free promo argument is harder to sustain for someone 2 decades into a career, where the gap between public image and documented financial reality is the specific thing being exposed. Milo Face and Dave East, named in the original podcast episode, are worth a brief note. The eviction notice targeted Jones's entity, not the co-hosts individually. Their responses suggested they were managing distance from the dispute rather than actively defending it. Their exposure is separate from Jones's, and the record treats them separately. 3 conditions to watch. The first scenario: 50 Cent formalizes his position and pursues additional legal claims. Becomes real if a verified property transaction appears in Bronx County records connecting a G-Unit entity to the building. No such filing has been confirmed. If one surfaces, legal escalation becomes structurally available. The second scenario: the alleged media stake becomes the basis for a distribution or intellectual property dispute. Requires a contract establishing that arrangement to surface. Without it, this remains speculative regardless of what Sam claimed on the call. The third scenario, functional stalemate, requires none of the above. Jones retains the studio. 50 Cent continues posting until the engagement cycle exhausts itself. Both claim a version of winning. This is the scenario requiring the fewest unconfirmed condition, which makes it the most consistent with the observable pattern so far. 3 things you now own and can use anywhere. The debt number audit. The next time a specific dollar figure dominates a public dispute, check 3 things: where it came from, what it replaced, and who benefits from that number being the one that circulates. Court filing, social media caption, or one-sided phone call are not the same evidence. The sourcing tells you what the number is actually doing. The landlord alignment read: in disputes that escalate into public campaigns, the property owner's decision to cooperate or stay neutral is often the hinge the whole mechanism turns on. Ask who controls the infrastructure and whose side they've chosen. The image versus the record. A single piece of footage can do narrative work that hours of content cannot undo. The gap between what an image implies and what the underlying record actually establishes is where most of the story lives. That gap is always worth checking. The closing mechanism. Watch for a property filing in Bronx County records. If a G-Unit affiliated entity appears on the building's deed between December 2025 and February 2026, legal escalation becomes predictable. If no filing appears, the stalemate consolidates, and the campaign's legacy becomes entirely reputational. In a dispute where the deed is the weapon, who holds the deed is the only question that ultimately matters. Right now, the record doesn't confirm who that is, and that open question is the one worth watching.